Policy Alternatives Nova Scotia. My name's Larry Haven. I teach here at St. Mary's. I'm on the steering committee board of the Nova Scotia organization, and also I'm also on the national board of the CCPA. And Christine asked me to give you a bit of a background of how we got started on this critique of the Ivany report. Well, the main reason is that people were coming up to us, you know who you are, and said, when are you going to say something about the Ivany report? And we were very busy with the alternative provincial budget, but we always felt that we had to develop a response to the report. Now, I'll give you a tiny bit of my own view, and I'm not going to even pretend that this would reflect the view of a disparate set of roundtablists. There's enough panelists, the roundtablists. But I wrote something that appeared at the end of the alternative budget, and it came out almost exactly at the same time as the Ivany report. So I congratulate myself on how prescient I was, because what had troubled me for some time was how we go around kicking ourselves in the butt. And not only do we kick ourselves in the butt in Nova Scotia, but we let other people do it as well. The Prime Minister has done it. You know, all manner of people tell us how awful things are in this province. And certainly we are not living in a paradise. But let's get a grip, folks. So I wrote this piece, which originally was going to be titled, "We Don't Suck Too Badly, Thank You." But my fellow people in the alternative budget said, no, you can't use that title. So we gave it a different title. But I'm just going to read part of that. Is Nova Scotia really an economic basket case? Economists usually measure standard of living in GDP per capita. Now, GDP has problems, and GDP per capita doesn't measure how the wealth is distributed. That's another question. But it's a pretty good indicator of well-offedness. Nova Scotia weighs in at about $36,000 US per person per year. Let's put this in context. That's about the same as the US state of Texas, and higher than Illinois, Nevada, Hawaii, New Hampshire, and Pennsylvania. And it's higher than Italy, Singapore, Japan, Kuwait, and Spain. Not precisely your typical backwater. But if you Google backwater or basket case in Nova Scotia, you're going to have some lovely reading for a couple of hours. The other thing is we often hear that Nova Scotia is the Greece of Canada. So let me just find what I wrote about that. What about Nova Scotia's debt? Let's say makes us into Greece. Nova Scotia's debt per GDP ratio is 36.7%, which is down from the 48% that it used to be in 2000. The Provincial Auditor General's recent reporting about a slight uptick in debt provoked anguished cries of fiscal crisis from newspaper columnists and letter writers. But 36.7% puts us right there with our federal government, and considerably better than Ireland and Spain. Ireland at 117%, Spain at 211%, and Greece somewhere up there. So, you know, let's get a grip, folks. So the reason we want to look into the Ivany report is I think the Ivany report it's very big and it contains a lot of facts, but it's not really about the facts. It's about the message. It's about how we read it. And the way we read it is very important, because the message that it's sending is that we're a sorry place to be. We're not going anywhere. We have to stop using the public sector as a way of mobilizing our economy and start relying on business. One of the things I very much would like to look into, and I have a strong suspicion that the problem in Nova Scotia is not lazy workers. You know, whenever we talk about productivity, the implication is always that workers are somehow not working hard enough. I just want to remind everybody of something that Mathieu Dufour, who used to be an economist at Dow, and I wrote a number of years ago for CCPA-NS, in which he looked at productivity versus earnings over the past 25 to 35 years. And what we found was that in the 25 years leading up to about 2008, which was the beginning of the current recession, Nova Scotia's wealth, the actual wealth of the province, had grown by about 60%. In other words, we were 60% richer, and now probably about 65% richer in now than we were in 1991. So for that much richer, where did the money go? So, you know, the question is not one of lazy workers. I think it's one of lazy capital. And this is one of the things I certainly want to work on. If you look at all of the indicators in terms of spending on research and development, worker training, and other things that business should be spending its money on, industry for industry, Nova Scotia's record doesn't stand up to the rest of Canada. And I think that is where the major problem lies. But there's a wonderful phrase that the American Army invented during the first Gulf War. I don't know how many of you, none of you were around at the time, of course, but it was called grooming the battlefield. We were told about how the Air Force, the US Air Force, was grooming the battlefield, which basically means bombing the hell out of the enemy on the ground so that nobody's alive when you move forward. And I don't think it's too much exaggeration to say that psychologically and politically, that is what the Ivany report is doing. So today we've assembled a panel of, or a roundtable of people who will be commenting on the Ivany report. And just to remind you, this is not the be-all and end-all. The CCPA Nova Scotia intends to be doing quite a bit of work in the future on the so-called Ivany report. Thank you very much. Yeah. Oh, and just a reminder that there will be a sign-up sheet going around, so don't forget to sign it and then pass it on. Thanks.
Wow, thank you, Larry. We have a packed roundtable with lots of questions and rounds. I'm Christine Saunier. I'm the Nova Scotia Director for the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. Welcome, everyone. We do have some set questions that I will be moderating with my timer. It won't be my phone ringing, it will be my timer making noise to tell the panelists that their 2 minutes is up. We have 3 rounds of questions, and the 4th round will be a roundtable interaction, but we didn't have a roundtable. And the 5th round will be allowing the panelists final comments, and then we will open up. The plan is for this to take exactly 64 minutes. And then we'll open it up. So there is food coming, but it is at 5:30, so you have to be very patient. And it is an enticement for you to stay for the annual general meeting of our organization afterwards, should you be a supporter or want to be one and be more active. So I will begin by introducing our roundtable participants. To my immediate left, Gregory Hemming. Gregory is currently a municipal councillor in Annapolis County. In that role, he chairs the Annapolis County Economic Development Committee and is a member of the county's Municipal Climate Change Action Plan. Gregory holds a PhD in Ecology and Northern Studies. Over the last 30 years, he has been a constant voice for preserving rural places and a strong advocate for a steady state economy that adheres to the principles of ecological economics. To his left, we'll always be going left tonight, Eric Neustadt. Eric Neustadt has spent many years working in and around the students' movement, both in Ontario and across Canada. He recently moved to our wonderful province and completed his PhD in political economy at York University after completing that PhD. No, I guess before. And will assume a position in the politics department at Acadia University this fall. Until then, Eric is working as an organizer with the Public Service Alliance in Canada. Eric has also been working as a contract researcher and is a research associate of the CCPA-NS. Eric's research and writing has focused on higher education, the globalization of finance, and the restructuring of the welfare state in the West. To Eric's left is Monica Dutt. Monica is a public health specialist and family physician. She is the medical officer of health for the Cape Breton District Health Authority in Nova Scotia. She is also the chair of Canadian Doctors for Medicare and adjunct faculty with Cape Breton University. To Monica's left is Karen Foster. Karen Foster is currently the Banting Postdoctoral Fellow in Management at St. Mary's University. As of July 1st, she will be an assistant professor of sociology at Dalhousie University. Her areas of study are economic development, productivity, people's relationships to work, and youth employment. Tony Charles is a professor in the School of Business and the School of the Environment at St. Mary's University. He specializes in interdisciplinary research on governance, management, and socioeconomics of natural resources and the environment. Tony is known for his work on participatory community-based management, as well as sustainability, well-being, and human dimensions of environmental and resource issues. He leads the Global Community Conservation Research Network, a multi-year research initiative on local conservation and sustainable livelihoods. Welcome. So, for our first round, how can we support real change in Nova Scotia? Since the early 1960s, there have been numerous major reports, commissions, and strategies, both private and public, aimed at steering the Nova Scotia economy. By last count, was that 11?
11.
The report of the Nova Scotia Commission on Building Our New Economy, often referred to as Ivany, is another in the long list of reports. In the introduction, the Commission admitted it had, quote, difficulty in finding the right voice and tone with which to talk to Nova Scotians about the seriousness of the challenges we now face and how we might, as a province, begin to overcome them. The first question is in two parts. Do you feel the tone, now or never, is the right one for a strategy intended to rally support for real change in the economic picture here in Nova Scotia? And two, the Commission makes it very clear, if the recommendations put forward by the Commission are not implemented, the economic future here is dire, catastrophic, perhaps unsalvageable. Is this your assessment of the Nova Scotia economy? And we're going to start this way. Gregory, you have 2 minutes for that huge question.
2 minutes. Well, thank you for being here, and thank you for the Center for Policy, Canadian Center for Policy Alternatives, for hosting this discussion. I'm always excited about exploring options and creating a dialogue about economic reports. I would like to say that anyone that tries to tackle what the Ivany Commission did is in some ways ought to be applauded. It's a very difficult topic. It's not something that's easy to talk about, and it's something that can inflame people quickly. I was a little concerned about any report that talks about the economy. And some of my research that, you know, between 1965 and now, there have been 11 to 18 different reports that have tried to tweak the Nova Scotia economy in one way or another. And both federally and provincially, and someone added the cost one time, that it's been a cost of about $100 million to try and figure out how we live well in this particular place. So I was concerned, every time there's a report I'm concerned about it, and I like to look at it. But this report, even though it attempts in some ways to be thorough, it starts at a place that I would rather have not started. The starting point in this report is that we're not going to be successful unless we grow exponentially, very quickly, and unlimitedly. I'm not sure that's the most accurate starting point. So I have trouble with that, and I'll talk about that as we go through this. The title to the report was disturbing to me, and the idea that perhaps everything is so dire that we need a wartime analysis or a wartime look, a wartime restructuring of the political nature of Nova Scotia to meet these challenges is disturbing to me. While I know if you do not have a job, things are very dire. So I don't want to soft coat that in any way. But I think in general, things are not quite as dire as they're made out to be in this report. And what I do know from some experience is if you're looking for a fear-based approach to something, oftentimes, if not always, I think you make the wrong mistake. So if I could name that title, I would try to come up with another title besides Now or Never. And I'm out of here.
Thank you, Gregory.
Well, I'll just begin with a joke. that radicals sometimes tell themselves. There's two liberals are walking down the street and they see a homeless person begging for change. Give them a little bit of money. If you're kind and telling the joke, they give them a little bit of money. And then as they're walking past, they say to themselves, my, the system is broken, it needs to be made to work better. Two radicals walk down the street, they see the same beggar begging for change, they give them as much as they possibly can afford, and then as they walk beyond and talk to themselves, they say, my, the system is working exactly as it's supposed to. It used to be when you told liberals that joke, they would just say, well, it's the lesser of evils, the alternative is always worse. You would tell a social democrat and they would become uncomfortable because there was this tension that described social democracy and social democratic theory, wherein there was on the one hand the need to reform the system, and on the other hand this understanding that the system was fundamentally and irrevocably broken. Today you tell a social democrat that joke and they become exactly like a liberal, confident that it is the best of a bad set of alternatives. And so I think the Ivany report is not so much a canary, not so much an early warning system. I think it's rather kind of a dead canary. It's an indication that we're suffocating insofar as it treads upon a very well-traveled path wherein the market is accepted as the instrument through which economic growth and development can happen. And the role of the state is redefined such that the job of the state is to support the market, period. And what's disturbing is that while Ivany, I think, takes a particular approach from that point forward, it's been received uniformly by both the people on the left and on the right as, heralding the way forward, as clearing the path, as visionary. And I don't think it's visionary. It describes the context in which we exist, wherein there is no sizable political alternative today that's able to mount and voice an opposition that speaks meaningfully about the ability to propose an alternative to the market as the way in which to organize and promote economic development and or growth. And so I think to the degree that the Ivany report is horribly written, terribly researched, and by any measure or standard, not a particularly rigorous document, the fact that it could be written and championed by folks on both the left and the right is an indication of the road that we have to hoe. It's very significant. So I agree entirely with Gray. We are not in a crisis situation, but we are in a situation where we need to fundamentally change the conversation and have it in a way that the progressive forces in this province have not had much success in having it to this point. I'll leave it there.
Okay, so my background isn't economics or politics, although they're very connected to health, so it's great to be able to be part of this conversation, if only to force me to read the report and think about what it means to health. I guess I kind of separated between some of the tone and then the actual recommendations in the document. So in terms of an approach, taking it back to public health, which is what I do, sometimes you do want to scare people and motivate them to do something, and it can be a very effective tool, whether it's pictures on cigarette packs or things around texting and driving and some graphic images around that. But you have to couple that with what people can do to try to change the situation. And I think we'll get into that later, kind of what are some of the actions that could be taken out of this report. And I think I have some questions around what it actually motivates people to go on and do. The other question about the tone that I had is kind of a message for everyone in Nova Scotia. And again, in health messaging, we talk a lot about, do we do something across an entire population, or do you try to target it? And we found often with universal messaging or things you do across a whole population, the people who take up the message are often the people who are best able to do that because they are most control over their lives for various reasons. They have a higher income. They have other things that give them that freedom to take control. So I question that a little bit, to have a general call to everybody and not try to differentiate between some people who are more able or less able to pick up some of the call. And then in terms of whether the economy is unsalvageable, maybe a bit of a cop-out to say no because I don't think that's the right conversation to be having. I think, as was brought up before, some of those, if you're going to give that kind of fear message, I think we could be talking about the rising inequalities, we could be talking about poverty, we could talk about climate change. To me, those are some of the really big issues that if you're going to be having a crisis situation discussion, those are some of the things. So just overall, I think that, you know, it's a good start to a discussion about the economy, but it really needs to be put in this broader context of where we want to be as a province. Thank you.
I'd say that I understand the now or never tone. I think we have to see it as a strategy. It is the right tone for the particular ends that are sort of vaguely identified in the report. However, I think we're all today going to critique those ends. Calling the situation a crisis serves a purpose, and it's clear that the commissioners and the authors know that. The fact that they have to talk in the report about striking the right tone at all suggests that they know that part of moving forward, however we define that, is about controlling the discourse and channeling what is being said. Because if you control what's being said and how people think about the economy and the problems, then you control, to a certain extent, what can be reasonably done. So more problematic for me is the tone throughout the report that suggests that we as citizens and workers just have to change our attitudes in order to move forward. So just pull up our bootstraps and treat our challenges, the challenges that face us, through confederation, through being a participant in the global economy, to look at those challenges as opportunities instead. So there's lots of talk about how, and this is a quote, our attitudes and our relationships with each other need to change. I believe that our attitudes and our relationships with one another stem from political economic relations first, and that those are the things that need to be changed in order for attitudes to be changed, not the other way around. So chastising Nova Scotians for having a bad attitude is just the Stephen Harper quip about the defeatist attitude over and again, only it's coming out of our mouths this time. So it's not the right approach, it's not the right tone.
What, no music to finish?
It's under time.
Well, I think there's some very good points being made already on the panel, and I guess I have a couple of points. First of all, there were two questions posed here, and one was to do with the tone of the report, and I agree with the idea that if you want to get attention, you use that kind of tone, perhaps, and that this maybe differs from Gregory a little bit. Whether it actually is effective, it certainly succeeded in getting some attention for a report that could go on the shelf. And here's this week's Ivany clippings out of the paper. They keep coming along. So if the question is it a right strategy to get attention? Perhaps it is, but can it backfire? I think that's certainly a possibility. I think that the key that's already been raised is the difference between that question and the second part of this particular round of questioning, which is this particular doom and gloom scenario that's been put forward and the remedies that are put forward, is that the right blueprint? And that's indeed the real question here. What I particularly would like to do today is highlight the connection between economic well-being and environmental well-being. And the whole idea of the connection, I guess reflects traditional Mi'kmaq values in this part of the world between humans and nature. So that's an angle that I want to be putting forward, I guess, in terms of an aspect that's mentioned in the report, but then loses out its emphasis as the report moves ahead. And I think that's. And that's only one angle. Of course, the whole point that Larry mentioned in the start about the distribution of benefits in the economy is another huge aspect. So I don't mind there being a call to action in terms of the report itself. I think that the population trends and the economic trends are something that is worth looking at, and this is Ivany's the report's basic premise, I guess. The question is, what are the remedies? And I'm sure you've all noticed that these clippings, the papers are full of basically hobby horses being promoted of various sorts. And for me, the strategic question is, can I get my hobby horse prominent? And perhaps can we collectively get our interests out there? Because in a way, if this were saying there's a crisis, you need to adopt the alternative budget, then we might be saying, if that was the message of the Ivany report, we might be saying, okay, yeah, well, that sounds not too bad, but it's not saying that, and so we need to look more carefully.
Thank you. The next round of questions. This round is about the getting more specific, I guess, into the Ivany report. There's been some criticism that I've heard around it not adequately addressing some key issues. I think Monica has pointed to those as well as others that I've just spoken. There are many unarticulated assumptions in the Ivany report about economic growth, about the economic model being advocated. So a central concept that isn't actually defined in the report is the economy. Would you reflect on what you see as the defining features of the Nova Scotia economy? With that in mind, what kind of economic path should we be charting and how do we get there? In your answer, consider how this path compares to the one advocated in the Ivany report and whether there are different paths for rural and urban Nova Scotia. Oh, uploaded. So basically,
We get 3 minutes for this.
please. Yes. Did we have 2 minutes? No, it's 3 minutes this time.
And Christine, could you just speak a little louder?
Yes.
It's tough to listen to. The
Sorry,
sound,
we should have gotten mics.
could be used. People could come up here and speak.
The mic works up there?
We have to.
No?
No, just go ahead and I'll play around and see.
Okay, so for now, speak after. Well, I'm going to start with Eric. Come around. Is that okay? Okay.
So one of the things that Ivany does 55 times actually is use the word or some derivative of entrepreneurship or entrepreneurialism. By contrast, it mentions the word woman twice, both times in the context of mentioning men and women. So there's no attention paid to issues of gender and sexism. So I just want to read from last week's New Yorker. They had a little article, James Serwecki, on entrepreneurialism. It's found I quote, a 1997 study in the Journal of Business Venturing found that entrepreneurs are overconfident about their ability to prevent bad outcomes. They're also overconfident about the prospects of their business. A 1988 study in the same journal of some 3,000 entrepreneurs found that 81% thought their business had at least a 70% chance of success, and a third thought there was no chance they would fail, numbers that bear no relation to reality. On top of this, there's a widespread tendency to treat failure as a badge of honor. Fail fast, fail often is a familiar mantra in Silicon Valley. There's now a regular FailCon where people come to hear other entrepreneurs tell about the hard times they endured and about how starting a business and failing actually makes you more likely to succeed in the future. It's a comforting message, but the evidence suggests that past failure really just predicts future failure. So here, the Ivany report ignores all the facts about entrepreneurship in Canada and in Nova Scotia and fails to acknowledge what are some of the fundamental dynamics of the Nova Scotian and the Canadian political economy. Most people are employed by large corporations. Most people who are employed by large corporations enjoy better benefits and better pay than people who are employed by small startup businesses. Small startup businesses have, in fact, created more jobs over the last 10 years than have large businesses. They've also destroyed more jobs than have large businesses. The long and the short of it is that we need to recognize where most employment is in the province and adjust accordingly. What that means is that we need to harness the power of large organizations through retooling the state in a fundamentally different way. And this is not part of the conversation at all. And this is where I think the real break from Ivany needs to come. We need to be able to place back on the table conversations about the role of the state in fueling and facilitating economic development, not by harnessing the power of the private sector, but by actually acting in the interest of the public itself. And that's part of the conversation that, as I said before, has been completely erased. I think it is the part of the conversation that the alternative provincial budget really begins to start in a meaningful way, and that's what I point to as a starting point.
The mic is working. It will be fairly disruptive, but do you mind? Is that, people will have to get up and work.
Figure out how to be 5 foot tall. This feels much less roundtable-ish, but I'll go with it. So, in reading the report, no economy isn't defined specifically, but they do use kind of common economic indicators. So indicators around GDP, around numbers of businesses, around exporting and importing, which makes me think about how we define what we mean by economy. And these are some of the traditional measures, but can we change that? Can we alter that? And I bring it back to a health lens, that there's lots of things we could be measuring that our economy, jobs, all of those things feed into. And I think those are the things we should be looking at as our provincial goal. How can we be a healthy province? And that sounds really vague, but there's very good measurements of how to try to accomplish that. So for example, there's a Canadian Index of Well-Being, and many of you have probably seen a chart in Canada that our GDP goes up, our well-being doesn't. So what are we trying to achieve by increasing our GDP? We want to be healthier and healthier as a society, and there's very specific things you can look at. You can look at living standards, health, environment, vital communities, education, balance of time, level of democratic participation, access to leisure and culture. So all of those things are outcomes we want to achieve with things like, for example, what's coming out in the Ivany report. To me, that's the conversation to have. How do we get to that goal and use our economic system in order to do that? So in terms of an alternative path, that's what I would advocate. And that well-being index has been applied to Ontario, which again showed as economic growth has been happening, this well-being index hasn't been increasing. So again, how do we tie how we are in terms of well-being to our economic system? So there's really practical ways that can be done. There's health in all policies, which is this idea that any policy that gets put into place, you look at how it impacts people's health. So in Quebec, major policies are often required to go through that process. It can be used, say, for shale gas development. It was just done in New Brunswick by public health there. It can be applied to all kinds of policies to show how it affects our communities. So the same, I think, should be done around economic policies. How does it affect people from urban to rural, from poor to higher income? How does it affect our health as a community? And then looking at that, that's how we decide what we do as a province, as our different communities. And I haven't heard the bell yet, but that's all I had to say. So.
I figured that others could probably speak a bit more to the defining features of the economy, like the sectors, the specific challenges. I'm just going to comment on how the idea of the economy features in the report. There's a tendency in the report to, and in its recommendations, to conflate the economy with business. You see this in the recommendation to appoint a Minister of Business to be the champion of economic matters and to champion economic growth. And this sidelines the really important point that the economy is the people as much as it is business, and it exists to serve our needs. Society and economy are only separable analytically, and we've only actually had the idea of the economy as a separate sphere for about 70 years. We do well to think about the economy as something that's a part of society and not something that is either above society or that contains society or something that's inherently comprised of business and the resources that serve it. The economy is simply how we systematically produce and distribute the things that we want and need. by definition, it's about meeting our needs and not the other way around. So I'm really anxious about statements like we need to promote business more effectively through our educational system, because I think that that can tend dangerously toward idolizing wealth and diminishing other social values. So the idea of extending junior achievement, for example, to everyone alongside a diminished civics component in compulsory education is scary. Beyond this, just a little note on methods. I think it's interesting to note where in the report they compare Nova Scotia's numbers to other places and then where they just present them on their own. For example, in the breakdown of employment by business size that Eric was talking about, they just show Nova Scotia numbers on their own, but if you actually compare us to other provinces and other countries, we're really quite comparable, but they isolate it in order to make it seem like a crisis. That's all I have to say on that.
So maybe done in 61.
Well, I'd like to pick up exactly on Karen's point about this striking example in the report about the around the idea of the Minister of Business, especially the little allusion that that should be the Premier taking that role. I'm in a business school. I don't mind business. In fact, I would like to see more in the report on family business, on cooperative business, on green business, to push my economy and environment point a little bit. There's really an equation in the report, I find, between the aspect of entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship equals individuals doing stuff and businesses doing stuff, and individuals being business people in that context. I think that's an old-fashioned and divisive view of how an economy operates. It's this whole idea of focusing on business leadership. You know, there's a line that says we need business and community leadership in the pursuit of economic growth. Business leadership and community leadership. But when it comes to the community side of things, the whole focus drops away. You don't find that in there. And I want to say a word about community economic development in particular. Ivany agrees with Donald Savoy that, and it says in the report, the energies, resilience, and creativity of CED initiatives in rural communities will be valuable components of an effective provincial growth and renewal strategy. So it sounds positive about community economic development, but the overall tone is in fact negative. So I gave you a positive quote, but the headline in the report about CED is the limits of bottom-up development. So the headline says, you know, that there are limits. It's the only place in the report I can think of where it says the limits of something to do with economic development. You know, usually it's a kind of a promotion of the whole report's meant to be a promotion of economic development, but not when it comes to community economic development. Strange. Now, the provincial government support for community economic development, as you would all imagine, is tiny compared with the support for larger, big industry. What would the results look like, I wonder, if we flip that around, less top-down manipulation, more focus on community economics? You know, perhaps we need a revolution in how we look at that whole job creation front. I just want to say one word on the environmental side. There's some good stuff in the Ivany report on the environment and economy. There's an excellent backgrounder, I think, on green economy and social sustainability, linking together the environmental side and the social side of sustainability. There's support for one of the best pieces of legislation well, anywhere, perhaps the Environmental Goals and Sustainable Prosperity Act, known as EXPA. There's some other good stuff. There's a recognition of the need for regulation to avoid repeating past failures like the tar ponds and Westray. And so there's social and environmental angles there that I think are very important. But that being said, the idea of a green economy just isn't in the agenda, and it's one that's really missing and sort of noticeably missing. There's also the aspect of values, I think, that are important in terms of quality of life. So for me, there should have been much more attention to quality of life aspects, including environmental, including social, including the distribution of benefits. And that's surprisingly missing in the report. So I think on those two fronts, there's there's gaps, both in terms of how we look at the broad economic picture and in terms of how quality of life and environmental aspects come into the focus of the report. Thank you.
I guess I just want to go back and say, this report is complex. There's nothing easy about it. And when I have a hard time getting to the specifics yet, because I'm still working on the big picture. I'm trying to wrap my mind around where we're headed. In October 2012, I was asked by our council, I'm the councilor in Annapolis County, to attend a workshop down in Oak Island on the new economic model, which is regional enterprise networks. And that conversation took the good part of the morning. And in the afternoon, Dr. Ivany at least started to lay out some of the basic ideas that he had and some of the other commissioners had about what an economy is. What I noticed that morning, the first part of the discussion was opened up an hour and a half by Deloitte bookkeeping, Deloitte accounting firm. And they painted this dire picture that here's the economic, the GDP curve, and we're not on it. We're not getting there yet, we need to get there. When I started to do my research, I looked back in 1998 when they tried to restructure the economy to get to form regional development authorities. The lead presentation was by Deloitte. But again, we're not on the curve, we need to get to the curve. So I'm suspect about that. Tony mentioned Donald Savoy, and I'm fond of his work. But he wrote an interesting thing in 2010 in his Jobs Here. He said, we're still at the stage of trying various measures to see what works and what doesn't work. A little bit earlier in another report, Community Development in Atlantic Canada, False Hope or Panacea, the authors said, there is increasing national argument that the experiments of the 1980s and 90s, based on free market, export-based economies and the like, have transformed and weakened local and regional economies. And the last little quote comes from a report done in 2003, the Royal Commission on Reviewing and Strengthening Our Place in Canada. That report came to the conclusion that rural and regional development has proven a difficult nut to crack. For all the attention paid to rural and regional development strategies, there has been little coherent debate in Canada about the future of rural areas. I live in a rural area, and part of my major criticism of the Ivany report is I could not for the life of me see the rural in the report. Certainly addressed in some ways, but I could not get the rural flavor of this report. The idea is that at some level, whatever is good for the urban centers will trickle down to the small rural places. In a sense, if Halifax gets up and running, the powerful machine, at some point, there'll be some employment, economic opportunities for people in Annapolis County that may or that may not work. I think, living in a rural place, that the model ought to be absolutely flipped. That the strength in the urban centers is going to be a direct spin-off of what happens in our more rural areas. That's a hard thing to sell because we're not there yet. But what I thought about, if I was to start again with a new report, if I was to write a report and I had some game changers, I would list 7 of them. I hope I have time to get them in. I would start in a little different way. Here's the 7 I would use. Number 1, I would limit the use of materials and energy to sustainable levels. Number 2, I would stabilize the population. I wouldn't necessarily focus on growing it, but I would stabilize it. The third one, I would try and achieve fair distribution of income and wealth. Hardly any place in that report is the idea of income equality does it rise. Unless we focus on that, little else matters. The fourth one, I would try and reform monetary and financial systems for stability. Financial system is not working. The banking system is not working. It's a detriment to small places. I would change the way that we measure progress. I think that came up a couple times. Focusing on the GDP gives us some information, but not a whole lot of information. The fifth one, I would secure meaningful jobs and full employment. I would do that in something that Jane Jacobs once talked about import substitution. We need, at least in our rural places, create as much as we can locally without importing. That, to me, for us, is where the job creation is going to happen. And the last thing that's significant to me is that I think that we need to reconfigure the way business works. By that I mean, I think we've lost a sense of what business is or what business can be. Business used to be in small rural places, those energy drivers, those economic drivers that would help a small community put itself together. But over time, the emphasis is just on a reasonable rate of return for the investment. And until we swing that and redefine business slightly, I think that we're not going to get where we need to be.
The next round, are you going to start this one? Okay. This one's on what the Ivany report had to say about politics and democracy. The Ivany report is clear in its attitude. Now that we have a mic, shall we move it
So we
along?
don't get too much feedback. So who's speaking?
Monica is.
Okay, can you start and I'll adjust it?
Sure, I'll wait for
I'll
Vicky
finish.
to ask the question.
Oh,
So it
okay.
doesn't look like I know what she's
No,
saying.
While the active participation of leaders from the private and community sectors, this is a quote from Ivany, and from the other levels of government is essential, the primary responsibility rests with the provincial government. However, politics as usual holds the risk that the goals and targets, and indeed the basic commitment to the overall project, could become grist for the mill of partisan competition and electoral swings. In order to counteract the negative consequences of politics as usual, the Ivany report calls for a wartime or national emergency approach, even going as far as to suggest that we suspend the normal processes of partisan politics. Would you give us your views on the relationship between politics and, moreover, democracy and economics that will be required to address the challenges facing Nova Scotia? In other words, how do we ensure that economic decisions are made in the public interest?
Okay, I will not move again. So again, I kind of split this up into three different ways of thinking about it. So thinking first, just how do we improve the system as it is? So how do we improve our democracy so that it is more representative of what people want to do? So it's things like electoral reform. How does it become more representative? It's how do, the views of all people get translated into the policies and decisions that politicians are making, and how do they better hear what it is that people want, and how do they better represent us? I think there's also a second part of how do we change the democratic system. So there's some aspects that I've talked about a lot already, so I won't repeat, just around, for example, how we can picture our policies in terms of how does it improve health of our population, and maybe to say a little bit more about inequalities. I think we really need to have a better understanding of that. We definitely have a lot of good information, enough to guide us, but I think we do have a lack of data, which may be kind of boring, but it really guides the decisions that are made. So between, say, the urban-rural divide, we want to, I don't like the word divide, so disparities between urban and rural, how do we really see that in terms of education levels, in terms of income? We do have quite a lot of disparities between urban and rural, and we need to be able to understand that better to be able to inform a report like this. And then I think one of the things that could come out of the Ivany report, which would be wonderful, is how to critique how our economic system has contributed to those inequalities and disparities in health. And why is it, you know, in the report they don't talk about, for example, temporary foreign workers, which is one of a major component of a lot of industries in I was going to say Cape Breton, it is Cape Breton, and also in Nova Scotia. So the Ivany report talks about, you know, bringing in immigrants from other countries who are going to start businesses, which could be great, but it doesn't acknowledge that we are already depending a lot on people from other countries, and how do we support people to have well-paying jobs with benefits, and there's other types of immigrants we could be supporting in other ways. So I think there's kind of three parts. How do we reform our system as it is? How do we change the discourse that we have around politics? And there's some good stuff out there. A colleague, a physician in Saskatchewan, has written a book, which I don't have with me because I just came from India, but it's called A Healthy Society. And it's really all about, in politics, how we can start talking about a healthy society. And it's a great, short, fairly easy read. And then how do we change our economic system to better be a healthier society? And I think that's some of the bigger questions that I think are coming out in this discussion, because they've contributed to some of the health disparities that we're seeing.
I'm taking a bit of a broader view of the question about politics, because I think that the report, it doesn't only talk about politicians. It talks about the need to break down divisions between rural and urban and different interest groups and stakeholders. So I'm considering all of that in this. And it's actually my biggest beef with the Commission's report. They aren't wrong that a significant barrier is the lack of a shared vision and a commitment to economic growth and renewal, yada yada. But I think that it's naive to think that we can overcome these kinds of divisions with an attitude adjustment. The fact is that there are different interests, there are power relations between all of these institutions and communities, and especially between social classes, and these don't disappear just because we want them to. They can only be changed with structural change in the way that we produce and consume and share resources, and that is all bound up in a national and global economy that is even harder to change than our local ones. The problem is that making business grow and having economic growth it's not a value neutral goal. We have to consider who does what and who gets what in an economic growth agenda. And I think when we ask those kinds of questions, we see very clearly that the reasons for conflict are, or what they are rather, and we'll be confronted with the fact that they won't change unless the organization of production and distribution of wealth are changed. What I think this boils down to is that the report, and like so many of the initiatives and ideas that we hear about our province's future, is class blind. It's blind to entrenched structural inequalities. So the report doesn't acknowledge, just like these other initiatives, that some people have wealth and some people don't. And for that reason, we can't have an apolitical conversation about the economy where everybody just gets on board with a single vision. But one of the things that I see in my historical research, and that comes up again in this report, is that whenever economic growth slows or productivity growth slows, government and business look around and they say, well, the problem is that we're not cooperating with workers and with each other. And so this has given rise to, in the past, traveling conferences of labor and management and the government. That was in the 70s and then the 60s, and other short-lived government policy branches and research branches. So it's the same old thing over again. Here it's subtle, and it doesn't say anything decisive about class or wealth inequality, which is a conversation that I think we do have to have. The Commission isolates some divisive issues like open pen salmon farming and maritime union, but that's misleading because the whole thing is a divisive issue. Let's see here. There's an ignorance of larger fundamental divisions between those who control production and reap profits and those who have to sell their labor for income. And this parenthetically gives lie to the idea that entrepreneurialism is something that's just going to spring from the soil or from our collective will. The last thing is about political leaders specifically. The idea that they could put aside their differences is just, it's very funny to me, because whenever someone claims that something is or should be apolitical or nonpartisan, there's usually a very specific ideological agenda that's being passed off as a universal, inarguable one. It's often in service of dominant interests and preserving a status quo. So I think we do well to say, what is this agenda that's being passed off as neutral and something that we should all get on board with?
Yes, what she said. Well, let me carry on from that point. So my particular thing again is the link of the economy and the environment, but also community, the power of community. I guess the role of communities in playing a role. And I mentioned about community economic development being somewhat downplayed, I guess, in the report, and of course downplayed in a lot of government economic activity as well. So so for me, that particular angle of support for community economies, I guess, is one that that I would particularly have liked to have seen more of in the report. How does that relate to the politics, to democracy? Well, you know, I guess I think it was Monica that said earlier that if you're going to declare a crisis, you need to give people an idea of what they can do. And I think this was one of the biggest failures in the Ivany report. And Karen was alluding to that, I think, as well, in the sense that, you know, what exactly is the Ivany report asking the people of Nova Scotia to do? Well, you know, if you judge from, I guess, the post-Ivany discussion, it was to change our attitudes. And change our attitudes in what direction? Well, you know, there's that's a good question. What direction are we meant to change in? And that's where I think essentially those with the loudest voices, and again, kind of reflecting what Karen said, are trying to get, you know, those are trying to get the loudest voices to change in the direction that people want, or perhaps it's not changing very much at all. Perhaps it's a status quo, but we all give in to the status quo. So I think there's three angles. First of all, I think in terms of the politics of democracy, the government needs to respect some of the processes that the citizens of Nova Scotia have been participating in. And in my case, I'm thinking here of environmental and natural resource processes over the last several years that have called for more attention to sustainable forests, to biodiversity and a coastal strategy. The natural resources strategy that came out through a citizen process a few years ago really called for restoring the faith in citizen engagement in Nova Scotia. So there's a lot of citizen processes that have taken place, and you know, I think a move to link the political side and the economic side would be to really pay attention to some of those processes. I've called for a Nova Scotia Fund for Community Economy and Environment as a way to try to focus attention on the community economy and the community environment and what communities can do around the province, linking values, vision, and participation in that mode. So I think that in some sense, you know, there was some interesting public opinion polling. And just to close on this, the Ivany report found that 80% of Nova Scotians, one of the biggest majorities of any of the questions they asked, said that environmental protection should take priority over job creation. What an interesting statement, that environmental protection should take priority over job creation. Well, you know, that's a little bit antagonistic, one side or the other. But I think what it reflects is back to the point I was getting at earlier, quality of life. Quality of life is so crucial. I know that doesn't get at some of the political economy aspects of whose quality of life and who makes decisions, but trying to integrate beyond the narrow thinking of the status quo economy, I think, is the crucial thing there.
Thank you. By profession, I'm a politician. So when I hear about someone trying to suspend politics, I get quite nervous. But I want to get around that. I'll back to that in a second by telling a story about what we're doing in Annapolis County. And this, I don't want to confuse two things. One is we're talking about regional enterprise networks, and the other is we're talking about the Ivany report. They do dovetail together in some ways. But we decided to, in Annapolis County, to create our own economic development strategy. The way we achieve this is we have 11 counselors, and of those 11 counselors, we put 5 to work on creating some economic targets. And those targets came by of these politicians, these 5 politicians, and then 11 counselors, in the general consensus, to identify some economic development targets. And that came about by these councillors talking to each other about the people they represent. It was democracy at work. Here's the 5 targets. We decided to look out at 2050. By 2050, Annapolis County would hope to be able to produce 80% of its own food locally. We would like to be able to produce 80% of our own electrical needs, energy needs locally. By 2050, we would like to be able to have it possible that we can create safe, affordable housing for anyone at 25% of minimum wage. The 4th target is that we would like to be able to put in place an educational system that allows people to get an education, a place-based education, that would allow them to continue to live in Annapolis County as opposed to moving someplace else. And the last target, I think Tony came to that very quickly, that Annapolis County will do everything that it can to keep clean air and water and uncontaminated soil as part of its economic development strategy.
Thanks. Just as I think when you accept the idea that the market has to be central to anything and everything that you do, then you can just tinker around the edges of the edges in terms of policy. I think what Daryl Dexter was talking about, support for apprenticeship programs and small businesses, and the Conservatives were saying largely the same thing. Just as I think that's just tinkering, when your definition of democracy is procedural, i.e. you vote every 4 years, it's not doing very much to then suspend those rights temporarily for the benefit, allegedly, of Nova Scotia. Of course, the Ivany report goes further than that. It labels anybody who disagrees with that effectively a seditious naysayer. And then it also provides some ideological cover, again by reference to entrepreneurialism, where effectively your failure is yours and yours alone. Don't come looking to government for any handouts, you seditious naysayer. So this is all in contrast to the things that you're hearing across this table. Much more meaningful and vigorous definitions of and understandings of democracy that place economic questions front and center. So participatory forms of finance and the distribution of capital to seed new businesses and community development programs. Gregory was telling me earlier at another meeting about a municipal bank that they've started in Annapolis County. So I think whereas the Ivany report has some significant contempt for meaningful forms of democracy and ultimately relies on a very conventional and procedural notion of democracy. What we need in order to actually fuel the kind of economic development that could help Nova Scotians, most Nova Scotians, in a meaningful way and address the distributional questions that everybody is pointing to. We need much more vigorous and participatory forms of democracy that help build people's capacity to bridge the political and economic and social issues that are sold as separate by Ivany.
The next round was to actually allow you to interact. You haven't been in the same room, you haven't heard each other's answers to these questions before. I have allotted some time to allow you some interaction and then some final comments. So should we go with some interaction? Anybody want to jump in? Well, we will open up to questions for sure. Yeah, but not right now.
I just want to jump in for just a second. To clarify something, Annapolis County has not, before you all rush out and take your money out of your local institutions and invest it in Annapolis County, don't do that quite yet. This is an idea that's come out in Annapolis County in a very limited sense, and it's in a variety of a number of places, that it may be something to look at to create municipal lending institutions that really lend for very specific local projects. Whether that's possible or not with municipalities and the Municipal Government Act, I'm not sure, but it's something that we want to be, give some thought to. So leave your money where it is right now.
I feel like I've agreed with pretty much everything that's been said, and I'd like to move to Annapolis Valley because it sounds like a wonderful place to be. And I think agreement may be one of the difficulties with this panel is how to get people together who have vastly different perspectives talking about economic development, the economy, and before reading about how there were numerous economic reports and panels that have already happened, I had some hope in the fact that there is a public health physician on the follow-up panel. There are some, at least from Cape Breton, some great people doing really good community economic development work, and I'd like to try to hope that from this report will come recommendations that do try to get at some of the things that we've all been talking about. But I don't have anything that I would disagree with, I think, on this panel, and I've definitely learned a lot.
I'm curious if my fellow panelists if there's anything that stood out to them in the report as a positive. I have some. I'm just wondering if other people.
Well, yeah, I think you know, any report is written obviously by the members of the commission, and if you look at the members of the commission and kind of make a little deduction of where certain parts of the report came from, you can make some guesses. I mean, I haven't done the research to figure out, to interview people and see if they admit to having written different parts. But as I mentioned, the green economy and social sustainability backgrounder in it, which is not the core of the report, but it's a backgrounder, I think is excellent. I mean, I must say, you know, I think that there's, on the environmental side, I think there are some positive points being made, as I mentioned earlier, but they simply fade away in terms of the overall thrust of the report. So, you know, bits of it are strong, and you might kind of guess where these different bits come from, and then other bits are, you know, critiqued the way we've seen here. That would be the way I look at it anyway.
We had this conversation, part of it is in preparation, I guess, for this panel about what the nature of a response should be. Would it be to try and focus on some of the positive aspects of the report, or do we want to call for the report to be much more fundamentally rejected? I think everybody knows where I stand on the issue at this point. I think the degree to which this report provides room to fake left and move right is considerable, and cause for us to fundamentally reject the report. Not in that there aren't some positive components, mention of community economic development, albeit again, as Tony pointed out, under the heading, the limits of local economic development. I think that's the signal of this report. We need to talk about environmentalism, we need to talk about community-based economic development, but what it's really most fundamentally about is providing some ideological cover to press entrepreneurship and the transformation of our educational system in a very fundamental way, extension of junior achievement, the reorientation of university-based research, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and then blame individuals when they fail. And also, and this is the other thing that comes out of the report, I think is one of the most stunning and consistently, whereas everything else is rather inconsistently spoken about, support for tax expenditures and deferrals for large corporations. It says the only thing that we need to adjust in the system of evaluating when the government should support big business by giving them tax holidays is the transparency of the system. They've made good decisions in the past, even though we've gotten burned a few times, but we just need to be more open about how those deliberations happen within the confines of the bureaucracy. So tax expenditures and deferrals for the largest corporations, and then this entrepreneurialism for everybody else. And I think those are the two, for me, standout features
that provide, all the clearest indication of what the report is really about. I think the rest is just kind of window dressing that allows, Ivany and the powers that be to kind of fake left and go right and avoid having the much needed conversation that you talked about, Karen, and that's one about meaningful forms of structural change.
Yeah, and I find a lot of good material in that report. If nothing else, that report stimulated this conversation. It was a good point of beginning. I would do things slightly differently. I think that the commission hit most of the important areas. Climate change mentioned in there at one level. I would put climate change up at the very top. That if we don't mitigate climate change, nothing's going to make a lot of sense here, and that's where the new economy is going to come from. So it's just a matter of shifting that, and I think these conversations are important, and they would not have happened without the commission's report.
Any other final comments? We'll open up to questions. Good. Okay, over to you. Questions? I'm not sure how we're going to deal with the mic issue. I can reach you.
I agree with most of what has been said about the deficiencies of this thing. In terms of politics, there doesn't appear to be any organized political body or group that might take this critical message and turn it into something more positive at a provincial level. That I hear about the Annapolis experience, that's a local experience, which other people could imitate. But I haven't, in the mass of clippings, I haven't seen any of the existing political parties sort of say very much about, yes, we're going to try to do this, or we like this part, we don't like that part. So how would you envision a political movement coming into existence that might move this in a more positive direction and deal with these structural issues?
Just take 2 questions and then thanks. And questioners have a minute before my thing goes off.
Thanks so much. Kyle Buick, Secretary-Treasurer of the Nova Scotia Federation of Labour and President of the Halifax Labour Council. I really want to thank one of the panelists for saying that the report is class blind, because that was the first thing that struck me when I read it, is that this report was actually written for Nova Scotia's 1% to continue their control of our economy. So we're dealing with kind of 2 twin crises in the economy today. One is income inequality and the other is climate change, both of which don't feature very prominently in the report. And so my question to the panelists, because you commented how the report has a presupposition in terms of the market being, or capitalism itself being the fundamental of our economy. So is neoliberal capitalism the only economic option for Nova Scotia?
Just a brief comment, I guess, on the first question is that an uncomfortable truth for this room is that the left and progressives are fragmented. And so I think that there's a big challenge ahead of us if we all sort of agree on the basics, moving forward with a plan, with a vision, which I think is probably necessary if we're talking about moving in a positive direction, is going to be very difficult, and I don't know if it's possible as far as one unified movement goes.
I think you're exactly right. I think if we turn inequality into just a policy question, the game is up. So I think we need to begin to actually conceive of inequality as an indication that the system is working just great, rather than something that needs to be fixed by tinkering around the edges of the system. You've asked the $1 million question, right? And it's not just a question that's to be asked in Nova Scotia, but all over. I think, to my mind, that conversation is beginning, and not necessarily within the context of rejecting or criticizing Ivany, which is, I think, also the nature of our conversation. Do we respond to Ivany, or do we continue putting forward meaningful outlines of what the alternative is and what is in fact possible? And I think that's part of what we need to do. I don't think Ivany started a conversation about climate change. I don't think it's necessarily been provocative of questions that weren't being asked before Ivany was written. Certainly not for any of the people on this panel, I don't think. So I think to an extent, Ivany is maybe something that we can move beyond by being critical and hyper-vigilant about presenting clear indications and outlines of what the alternative is.
Just to add a bit specifically from the health perspective, I don't think we've done nearly as good a job as we could be doing to highlight things like inequalities and climate change. And to me, those are kind of the fundamental health, in a very broad sense, the most fundamental health issues of our time. And I think lots of major medical journals have been coming out saying this is, for example, climate change, the biggest issue we will be facing. So I think, speaking as someone who works both with community organizations, government, on all different levels, I think that's the conversation as healthcare workers and providers we really need to be bringing to the table, because there's only so much you can do with healthcare service delivery. We need to be looking at health in this broad way to talk about those issues you've been talking about, and I think that can be used as a unifying force. But along with the issues we've mentioned, that there is a lot of fragmentation, to bring everyone together to be bringing that message, I think, is the challenge. We're doing it in bits and pieces, and some people are doing more than others, and how do we kind of bring that message? I think work is happening, but it is, from my perspective, happening too slowly.
Well, I think that there should be consideration for a second report. What's missing from Ivany report, and this, I mean, if I can say, this panel has highlighted some key ingredients of that. I think of what's missing or downplayed, or I mean, perhaps wrong, but I would target it on more what's missing, or let's put it in a positive sense. You know, the follow-up to Ivany, the implementation of Ivany report. You know, when you have one approach would be to say this will disappear soon enough, and you know, just ride it out. But we have this whatever that's called, this post-Ivany report commission with the 3 political parties being chair and vice chairs of it. You know, I think there could be a very timely product come out that's essentially implementation of Ivany that puts forward aspects that have been highlighted here, and maybe that's, you know, just way too naive, because you know, but somebody's doing that. You see it in the newspaper, as I mentioned, all the time, the 10 steps to this, and the 10 ideas from somebody at the Chronicle Herald and so on. There's certainly plenty of material that we have here on putting forward that kind of angle.
I just had time to respond to your question. Great question. I don't know the answer to it, but I do think that it's going to take, I guess I'm a strong believer in the democratic process. It's going to take enough people to show up, write letters, ask politicians to think about this. I guess it was almost a year ago, I called, I didn't know Christine at the Policy Center, and I called her, I said, look, help me, is there any way to get an alternate panel out, as the Ivany's panel out, just to create, not confrontational, but just another panel with different topics. And so I think that finally ended up here. That's where we're at. But I think there is in a sense, this other commission that Tony was talking about, 12, 15 business people on it, all 3 political parties. You need to monitor that, see if it's working. Is it going where you'd like it to go? And if not, I'm a counselor. Call your counselor and say, look, I've got some concerns. Can you help me with this? Where would I like to go? Where would we need to go as a county, as a province? So I think the grassroots does work, but it takes a lot of energy on your part to make it work.
I'll take 2 more questions and then we only have 5 minutes left. I see more than 2 hands. I saw one. Wow, that's 4 hands. What would you like to do? Shall we take 4 and? Okay.
Why not have all 4 together?
Yeah, that's what
Hi, I was just wondering, can you name 2 things that the average person could do in the next 60 days that would positively impact the economy and Nova Scotians' everyday lives? Thanks.
Easy. Mary and then.
Yeah, as somebody who runs a program at St. Mary's on training cooperative managers and leaders, I noticed the absence, the relative absence of reference to cooperatives in the Ivany report, although they do have a very good case study of a forestry cooperative in Quebec. However, if you look at the composition of the people who are that the government has chosen to implement the Ivany report, there's nobody from the cooperative sector. And yet I think there are a few better ways to have local, sustainable, non-profit making organizations that belong to the people to develop the economy than cooperatives.
I wonder if the panel at least agrees with the fundamental premise that for the need for this report, and that was that without changing the economy, the demographics point to a looming failure in the Nova Scotia economy. So unless we do something, there will be a failure. Also, could not some of the suggestions from the panel just be bolted on to the report as further to enhance the report rather than throwing out the report?
Steve, do you want to fill out your question?
It's almost for your information sort of thing, but in the report, one of the few things that the report made almost a concrete suggestion about, I mean, I was amazed at how vague the whole thing was the use of the school system. And Kyle brought up something that made me want to talk about this just very briefly. It acts as though the school system does not promote entrepreneurism. There's a whole department of the education system in this province for entrepreneurial studies. And it came up quite a few, I'm a teacher, I retired quite a few years ago, and I'm pretty sure that's still there. And, you know, I mean, any student who wants to can take it. It's, as far as I know, it's what you would expect, just like the economics courses, extremely mainstream, you know, capitalist approach to all of that sort of thing. And I just found it interesting that almost the only place they could find concretely to do their work, in a sense, was the school system. And the, what's that other young...
Junior achievement?
Junior achievement, thank you. Junior achievement. We teachers in the school don't get you, I've never been offered a choice. Mr. Hart, you're being visited today by junior achievers, you know, let them in your room, and they go and they talk, and it's usually they're not zealots, but they're, you know, they're kind of along those lines, and they just come in, they say whatever they want to, and they always end up with a kind of political, ideological approach. It's not very sophisticated, but it's there. And of course, they have their clubs. And our schools, by the way, also open themselves up for free to this. And what bothers me is that the report acts as though, you know, this would all be new, these kinds of things. And it's, you know, there's this appeal to have us further this and extend it.
Thank you. Since that wasn't a question, if you have a quick question.
Yeah, my question actually kind of can hop onto that.
Okay.
Whatever statement. Yeah. So, and I guess it's immediately for Karen, but I guess it's for everybody. You talked about how there are all these unarticulated assumptions, like the concept of the economy, and you know, there are these supposed traditional indicators like the GDP or whatever. But and you raised the question, how traditional are these things, right? But the corollary of economy so construed is like also a certain picture of human nature, right? That's so ubiquitous that it's completely invisible until people start fighting over it, right? So you go to someone and you say, you know, there's inequality is a problem, and the response might be, oh, well, everyone has an opportunity. And then you could say, well, no, they don't really, because this and this and this. And then the response would be, oh, well, I mean, if we start trying to adjust those, I mean, well, have you heard of the Soviet Union? Right? So it's a question of like discursive strategy, I guess, right? Really, I mean, you know, this causes me considerable anxiety and frustration and apprehension. Like, how do you go up against the system that rests on these sort of like ontological categories that people don't even aware that they deploy every single day in their lives? Right? How do we deal with that? Because policy, like nothing can structurally change in policy unless there's a sort of like an associated change at this kind of like ontological or transcendental level.
Okay, some easy questions. Anybody? 2 things. Ontological, dominant discourse.
I think we could probably each give you about 10 things. There's a donation jar there. That's the first thing I'll point to for everybody to support the work of CCPA-NS. That's very important in articulating an example. Do you drink coffee? You might support local baristas who are trying to organize. You can go and talk, yeah. Are you faculty anywhere? I think there are probably a lot of faculty here. St. Mary's just announced that it's going to proceed through a program prioritization process. Learn about it if you're faculty. Fight back against it. Start with those local contexts that you exist in and move in and out of every single day. Become aware of how the work that you do or don't do reproduces social relations and economic relations of power and inequality, and start to change them. I don't think it's a matter of us presenting you with a series of vague and imprecise and impractical examples. That, on the contrary, I think we're full of those examples. It's just a very encompassing strategy that you need to develop and deploy. And so it's hard to singularly enumerate all of the things that we need to do, and accept that inevitably we're going to have to navigate a whole field of contradictions as we do that. So it's a difficult thing.
I think I would agree with that point, so I don't have anything to add to that. I was thinking of the question around, do I agree with the premise of the report? And I'd say to some extent I do, because even just looking at, say, Cape Breton statistics, school enrollment is steadily going down. Real soon, you know, we'll get to a point that there won't be kids in school. Our age demographic, as with the rest of the provinces, is going up. I think, as has been kind of articulated, it's more, what do we do with that now? So I agree that something does need to change, but is it necessarily increasing our immigration and improving our economy in the context of the Ivany report? I think that isn't the way that we could be moving forward. So I agree with the premise that there are changes happening in Nova Scotia. We do need to do something, but I think there's been lots of options outlined today that are different ways to try to approach that situation rather than the specifics that were outlined in the report. So again, not to say that there's nothing good in it, but I think it is a different conversation than how do we improve our economy to address those changes. You can deal with the ontology.
Yeah. All right, so how do you argue with people's ontological assumptions that go right down to like human nature?
You have to.
I know. I mean, so I had thought a little bit along these lines in looking at some of the messages in the report that I interpret as more populist calls to eliminate red tape and get government out of business and all the stuff that's really appealing to people on the basis of those what I would consider very basic sort of selfish interests or self-interest. I think there is a way to sometimes channel those toward more, I guess, progressive or redistributive ends. You see it a lot, especially, and I don't mean to be this like young people are the future thing, but a lot of young people do want to make a difference and be the change. And if you can sort of appeal to that desire to have an impact on the world in a way that's not about making money and having a lot of control over resources, then maybe that's kind of a wedge into changing things. Maybe it's about alongside instilling an entrepreneurial spirit, or instead of, you could instill a sense that we can be in control of the way we make a living outside of a capitalist economy. That making a living isn't about making all kinds of money and buying things on the market. It might be about just managing to sustain yourself, as generations of Nova Scotians have done in the past. So I guess there are little wedge opportunities, but nothing so promising as like a way to change people's minds.
Well, thank you all for good questions, and CCPA for organizing this. I was trying desperately to think of a couple of good things for people to do in the next 60 days, and really the one I can come up with is I think the next 60 days is the time to get alternatives put forward. And honestly, after that point, other people have put forward their alternatives, and something starts, and maybe it's just that status quo that just gets by default to be the assumption. But I think there's a certain urgency to be putting forward alternatives in that. I think it was somebody said 60 days, the next 60 days. So that may not change the economy in the next 60 days, but I hope to change the discussion in the next 60 days, because I think there's a certain urgency to that. Larry, yes, co-ops, I mentioned that very briefly, but different models and community-based, community economic development, different models that have to be put in to that mix of the alternatives. The demographic issue is real or not. I'm persuaded by some issues about the demographic aspect being a concern, but on the other hand, there can be economies with small number of people, and there can be economies with large number of people, and it sort of depends what the nature of the economy is. So it's whether there was no proof. There was kind of a, what's the word in criticism called, it was a kind of a proof by assertion that there's a big crisis with the demographics. If our population goes down by 10%, is that a big problem? If it goes down by 98%, is that a big problem? So at what point is the problem there? I don't think it's really demonstrated, but I am persuaded that there's an issue there, at least, to be looked at. And just one other point, can the panel suggestions be added to the report, kind of supplementing the report? Well, I guess this was the point I was making, not just supplementing, but I think there needs to be a real statement of a kind of alternative, and it's not just an alternative like that one's garbage, here's what should happen, but to the extent that the alarm bell is being sounded, what is the answer? And I think there could be a very good product put forward about that answer.
Okay, 15 seconds.
I can do this in 15 seconds. I think one thing, the question was, what can you do in 60, 90 days, whatever. I think the most important, at least what I try and do, is remain hopeful. There's a lot of people working on those things that we talked about today: environment, equality. The writer Paul Hawken, who wrote The Ecology of Commerce, he would give a talk all over the world, and after the end of the talk, someone would come up and give him a business card, said, "This is what I do." And next talk, another business card. So he had his graduate students combine all these business cards, and he found out that in any one moment, there's 1 million people throughout the world working on these issues that are unconnected to one another, that have local-based solutions. So that I'm very hopeful that that this outcome will be a good outcome. So.
Well, on that, I would like to thank the panelists for agreeing to do this. apparently you could take the 10% shift, that's buy local. Pick that up, find out about that. You can continue to support our organization, help us with the next year's alternative budget. That's certainly an alternative. Very seriously, our annual general meeting will start in a bit, around 6 o'clock, but please stay. We have lots of pizza. If you can afford a donation, do so. If you can't, eat anyway. There's lots of food. Please don't leave without eating. Talk to other people in the room. This should spark some good conversations, and thank you all so much for coming out.